Howdy, BHRCers. You can find every episode of Why People on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcast content. On this Why People episode, episode number 3, we'll talk to Alex Lawrence, the Chief People Officer of the City of Boston, who has one of the coolest backgrounds you'll ever hear in the HR and people executive space. Let's do it. All right. Hello and welcome to Why People, a BHRC production. For those who don't know, the Boston HR Council is the largest HR and people executive community in the world at over 1,500 HR and people executives. I'd like to introduce co-founder of the BHRC and co-host of Why People, Paul Roberts.
Thank you, Sean. Happy to be here. Alex, wonderful to have you.
All right.
So happy to be here today.
Yeah, now happy to introduce our guest today, Alex Lawrence, who's the Chief People Officer of the City of Boston. A really cool guest and really excited to have this conversation, Alex.
Thanks so much for having me. You're too kind.
Yeah, so we're excited, Alex. So we'll kind of dive right into it. The cool part about Why People, I think, is we always follow the same kind of conversation cadence, but obviously everyone is uniquely different in the role. So their journey is uniquely different. So we'll just start, Alex. And happy to get into kind of your unique path to that Chief People Officer role. But if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about kind of you as a person, your background, where you're from, all that fun stuff.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. So yeah, I'm Alex Lawrence. I am the City of Boston's first ever Chief People Officer, which is truly an honor, and I pinch myself every day to think that is a role that I hold. I think I like to think of myself as somebody who is just like on my best days, a bureaucratic transformer. So I feel like every organization I've worked for could be described as large and bureaucratic. But I think the word bureaucracy gets a terrible rep. And actually, I think in general, right, like processes and doing things in large, complex organizations is a skill in and of itself. And so I think everything I've sort of done throughout the course of my career has really led to just being someone who likes to think about how we make processes and systems function for people in the context of large organizations. And this job is no exception.
Well, awesome. I love the background, Alex, and knew this was going to be a really fun conversation. So with that background, Alex, and I love kind of how you outlined the role or kind of the work. Could you tell the Boston HR Council just a little bit about your, let's start with kind of your educational background, how you were classically trained, shall we say?
Sure. Yeah. So my undergraduate degree is in sociology. Actually, if I start a little while back, I remember in 8th grade, I took one of those career tests and it told me, like in 8th grade, ran a bunch of questions that you're either going to be a psychologist or in human resources. And I was like, okay, like human resources, that sounds really interesting. And then I feel like as I learned more about HR and I thought, oh, this is where you make organizations help humans. And, I think as I learned more about that in real life, I realized that was not necessarily the reputation that HR had in real life, that it was really, this idea of being compliance driven and protecting, a company from its people. I think is sort of what the rep I learned later on. And so it's funny, I did not, none of my classical training is in human resources and feels like a really full circle moment to have landed here. But that was a long way of saying, graduated undergraduate in sociology, really was just focused on the idea of having a career which impacted systemic inequality. Started my career in big nonprofits in the city of Boston. Actually, the first ever job I was laid off from. 40 of us were laid off during what were I'm going to totally age myself very specifically, but whatever. There's no real way to tell the story without doing this. The economic recession of 2008. And so basically every single friend I had who graduated college in 2008, we were all laid off from our first jobs. And I was working for this Bay Cove Human Services, which is a really important mental health organization in the city of Boston. And basically, because of government funding cuts, they had to balance the state's budget. And so a whole bunch of us got laid off. I then ended up working for ABCD, Action for Boston Community Development. So another really long-standing historical nonprofit that does incredible work for the low-income population of the city of Boston. And the reason I tell this early story was so much of what I learned in this early time was sort of the idea that our organizations that are out there to help our most vulnerable populations are completely reliant on government funding and these structures that are completely without the organization's control. So in ABCD, we received the federal stimulus money at the time. We took an organization of 1,000 employees. We grew it to 2,000 employees. We shrunk it back to 1,000 employees 2 years later. And there was just so much that we were doing to basically chase the dollars, and so much of our organization that couldn't really be invested in because of the nature of that. So, when I was there, we still used paper time cards. We had sheets that had Telegram expenses on them. And so I really sort of both fell in love with the business idea of how do you turn a big ship, and the overall public policy idea of how do you make these organizations that are dedicated to vulnerable populations function through a funding reality. So I was torn between, do I get an MBA and really think about the organizational side, or a public policy degree and think about the public policy side? Ended up going the public policy route, went to the Harvard Kennedy School, got my master's in public policy there, and during my time at the Kennedy School, ended up really thought about local government, thinking about this idea of funding and these organizations that can stand and serve our vulnerable populations. And so I took a fellowship that was basically about creating innovation in local government, specifically at the city of Boston. My project that summer was really about technology transformation. And so then when I graduated with my master's in public policy, I ended up spending 10 years in the city's innovation and technology department, starting with managing sort of a rehaul of the city's permitting and licensing processes, ending up working on much larger things like how the city responds to constituent needs and the technology that underlies. But most of what I just was working on is systems change. How do you make big, clunky, interoperable systems, not just in the technology sense, but in the people and process sense, function and serve the people they're attempting to serve. And so ended up, did that work for a long time, ended up moving up through management, was the chief of staff of the IT department. And then to make the sort of end of this long story short, ended up leaving the city for a whole host of reasons after COVID, mostly burnout related, and just needing to take a little bit of a step back, and ended up working for a digital services consulting firm. And then basically when Mayor Wu, who's the current mayor of Boston, was elected, she asked me to come back. I came back in the interim CIO role. And that's when, I had said sort of throughout COVID, through these last few years in the workforce, I was just incredibly interested in the idea of not just how do we create systems that work for people, but how do we become an organization where talented people can learn and grow and succeed and be retained. And so much of what I had seen throughout the organization was that, everyone there was really, really well-intentioned, and we had incredible public servants, but that the structural pieces that made this the best place to work had a lot of room for improvement. And so at the time we had what was known as an administration and finance cabinet. So all of the city's HR and people functions orged up through the CFO. And essentially, we talked about the idea of really breaking those apart, not because, the financial health of the city isn't extraordinarily important, but because as probably many of the private sector organizations and people have realized over time, they're really having, in my case, human resources as well as labor relations, having a strategic seat at the executive table to really drive the vision of the organization and make sure that we can create the conditions for workers to thrive is so important. And so the mayor created the People Operations Cabinet, the first ever of its kind for the city, and basically broke out some of those functions out from underneath the CFO and created this new cabinet position. And somehow I'm in it, and it's been an incredible journey, and just really, really, I had done a lot of HR in previous roles in management that I had growing up, but growing through the organization and done a lot of work on the labor side. But now, I'm leading the structural part of it.
Yeah, such a cool journey, Alex. And I remember when we first got connected, almost 2 years ago now. The first thing you said to me was, I'm not really a traditional HR executive. That was kind of how you led. And my question was, could you tell me a little bit more about that? And you kind of gave me that background, and I've been blown away by it. So thanks for sharing, Alex. And for those folks, those listeners and viewers that don't know, would you mind kind of situating us with the actual size of the city of Boston from an employee standpoint, and just even over your purview from an HR and people ops standpoint?
Yeah, so it's complex, and we are, I think, a relatively decentralized organization. So the city of Boston, sort of, if you think about it as the most broadly defined, which includes quasi-governmental agencies, has about a workforce of 19,000. That includes, schools, police officers, firefighters, finance, like libraries, a huge purview. It also includes 47 different collective bargaining units. So when you think about the organized labor context, 47 unions is a lot. Probably not going to be a lot of people who have that sort of size and complexity there. So I have sort of general oversight over all of that. But in terms of sort of who I'm not like very actively responsible for running a payroll for, making sure that all the policy is set for, we have some quasi structures. So that's about a population of 8,000, sort of city of Boston proper, if you don't include the schools and you don't include the quasi-governmental agencies.
Sure. That's helpful, Alex. And how about in your kind of department in the HR function?
So yeah, in the HR function, we're talking about 70 people. The labor function, about 10 people. And then I also sort of randomly, in that sort of administration finance breakup that I described in the divorce, I also attained the registry department, which is the city's vital records. So think of birth, death, and marriage certificates. That also orgs up to me.
I mean, just thinking about that reminds me of watching Paul chase his whole family around and trying to coordinate everyone kind of at the same time. It must be a lot of work coordinating that dance, Alex.
Definitely. But I've been able to, I think part of the bringing the sort of the people operations to the strategic cabinet level, I've been able to hire just like a truly incredible team that obviously, makes this work. And we've been able to bring in some more capacity building strategic roles. Before it was basically like, a department head, and then everyone else was just doing ops. And so we've had very little ability to invest in more sort of like strategic planning roles. I think most of the functions that we do here, in our organization, you might see one person do it for the scale. In a private sector company, you might have 10 people doing just like thinking about the thing, whereas we have like maybe half a person thinking about the thing and a few people doing the thing.
Are you able to go out to dinner in Boston and not be recognized, or is it?
Oh, definitely. Yes. I'm not being recognized by the public. I know HR celebrities are really big, but, not.
Well, I don't know. After this podcast, that might change.
Well, Alex, that's a super helpful background for us to kind of, dive into the conversation here. And kind of where I want to move to now is how you're thinking about the people in HR function currently, and I'm interested because your background is so unique. You've been a part of so many different projects and initiatives and moving things forward. So as you think about the role right now, and you don't need to necessarily speak specifically to your role at City of Boston, but just how are you thinking about it, and how do you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who is reading the news carefully, or maybe even not that carefully, understands that, in the moment that we're in, coming out of the pandemic, and in a sort of modern workforce reality with the labor market, I think recruiting and retention is hard everywhere. I think layering government on top of that really is a double challenge. There are tons of constraints that I think are unique to government, and very good reasons why, government is built to last. So it is always going to take a long time to turn a big ship when everything is prioritized towards government lasting. And all of that is a good thing. But it means that changing and being reactive, or responsive rather, to the world is challenging in the best of times. And so, I think if anyone has read about, this is not like, none of these challenges are unique to Boston, unique to my organization, or even unique to government, but I think they're really emphasized here. So really, truly, it is not just thinking about for me, how we get good people into government, it's like, how do we make government a good place for people to work? And I think we have, in so many ways, so much going for us in government, and we need to just be really, really like way better at telling that story about why government is a incredible place to work. I think, in generations ago, people understood the huge value of the stability of government jobs, especially in like an inflationary economy, understood the benefits of a long-term, if you work for the city of Boston, you pay into a pension system. A lot of people sort of sneer and point their nose up at that concept because it means you have to stay a pretty long time to see the value. But if you do see the value, it's a pretty valuable thing. And I think there are tons. I think it's both, how do we make our organization a great place for people to grow and thrive and succeed in their careers, but also how we better tell the story that is a thing they can do if they come and work for the city. So much of what I'm working on is really figuring out how we tell that story.
And it's interesting, Alex, you kind of assuming the first ever chief people officer position for the city. It's not like you were walking into City Hall for the first time. I mean, essentially, I know you took you did some consulting in between your previous role with the city, but essentially you kind of walked down the hall and took a new office. So a question is, having so much familiarity with the city and City Hall, was there anything, or maybe what was the most striking thing that in this new role kind of made you say, aha, or geez, I never realized that, or I never noticed that?
Yeah. So I think that the truism that for me rings so true in this job, but honestly in any role I've had in the context of government, is like, it is super easy to look on the outside and be like, what idiot thought this thing was a good idea? Or, just be really snarky about the way things are. And I still am, that on my less good days. But I think fundamentally, like, a truism that I've seen is like almost every single decision that you look around and you see, any vestige of something where you're like, why is it that way? Was a smart, thoughtful person who made a really good decision based on the resource constraints and the knowledge they had at the time. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't change it. Not at all. But I think especially with some of the things in some of our hiring processes that have a ton of steps or are sort of like bureaucratic checks and balances, it might mean that we overbuilt for an edge case, like, some bad thing happened and we made it more complicated for everyone as a result of that bad thing. But usually there's a very good reason. And so I think it's a question of like, how do we take those 10% edge cases where something went wrong and like not overcorrect and move back towards just in general making it more easy and accessible for more people while mitigating those possible, the compliance pieces that I said that HR had that reputation, right? There's good reason why it has that reputation. Those things are important. But I think really just bringing that more sort of like building towards the more common use cases and having our processes be able to handle exceptions differently is fundamentally a huge core of what I do. So anyway, that was a very long way of saying fundamentally that the thing that surprised me is like, I expected to be like, oh my gosh, why is everything this way? And there's a lot better reasons why things are this way. Again, that doesn't mean they're not ripe for innovation or change. But like I said, it's not usually a bunch of idiots making bad decisions.
Well said, Alex. And we've chatted. I also have a nonprofit and municipal background, so I appreciate that the thought there. And you did a great job earlier in the conversation, kind of outlining. I wouldn't even say that they're challenges; they're just more realities of the work and of the industry. As someone as tech forward as yourself, was there anything that was an easy change or something that you were able to kind of make modern, almost right away when you kind of got into the seat?
Yeah. So it's funny, I feel like as a technologist I am more skeptical about the promise of technology to solve people and process problems than I would be otherwise. Almost always, it's not about buying, especially in this complex context, like a fancy software that's going to automate a thing. It's about like having shared understanding of what a process actually is and having the humans inside of the organization trained on that thing. But I do think there's a lot that overall the sort of like civic technology space and frameworks can provide in the human resources context. And a lot of that is the concept, I think, of like I think put most simply, user research. It's really easy to assume, in our case, users or job applicants or our current employees, that we know what they want because we've seen certain edge cases, but that is always going to be biased by the things we've personally experienced or the people that we meet. So one of the most exciting things that we've done recently and are still just finalizing this initiative is we hired a specific user research firm to help us reach some job applicants who haven't applied for government jobs, right? Because we only know the people who are already in our process. We don't know the people who aren't considering us because of a perception they have, et cetera. And we have learned so much from this engagement. I think just so much about how we can demystify what it might mean to consider one of our jobs. And so I think we have visibility into, it takes too many steps to approve a job requisition, et cetera. But there are this whole host of other things that we don't directly have visibility because it's like who's not coming to the door, that I think borrowing from the idea of like actually going to talk to real humans and doing user research, that is what product managers think about and what technologists think about. That has been super useful in our context.
Well, that's great. And it sounds like quite the exercise that you all went through.
Yeah. But there are professionals who do this and they've been super helpful.
So Alex, a question, how much or how great does your City of Boston general knowledge and factoid knowledge need to be the first ever chief people officer of the City of Boston?
I think it certainly helps, right? And again, it goes back to that sort of like, it's easy to identify low-hanging fruit. It is hard to determine which of that low-hanging fruit is the most valuable of your time, right? There's a lot of things I could touch and make better because, as I said, I think this whole piece of the organization has been chronically under-resourced for a pretty long time and not really given the attention that it needs. And so I'm super excited to be doing that. But I think my specific knowledge coming in is like, I know what it feels like to be a department, which is a core end user. I know what it feels like to be an employee. And I have a lot of understanding of how our pretty complex bureaucratic processes work. So it certainly doesn't mean I know everything or that my ideas are right. But I often say in this organization, it takes a year before you literally know what's up or what's down. So I have a pretty significant head start.
That's great, Alex. All right. So before we kind of transition into the conversation around what we think is next or what you're thinking about for the future, you did kind of highlight a little bit about the city's hiring and open positions. So and maybe this is a shameless plug, but curious, what roles are open right now that maybe the common person like Paul and I that maybe haven't checked the City of Boston job board in the last couple of weeks would be surprised that they're there. Just curious about that type of conversation.
Sure, yeah, happy to take the shameless plug wherever I can get it. I think one key place that we saw a lot of attrition in the last several years was specifically in our key administration and finance roles in departments. So, for example, our human resources director for the Boston Police Department has been open for a pretty long time, one that we're really actively recruiting for. A senior director of administration and finance in our Age Strong department. So think of that as everybody who supports the elderly population of all Boston. So all of the programming that goes to the elderly population. We have a commissioner, but then we have a really important senior role of administration and finance who's writing grants and also overseeing HR and labor relations for that department. So we're a workforce of 17,000, 19,000, depending on how you slice it. And so, it's a conglomeration of a ton of departments, which are functionally in some ways, they could be the libraries itself I think we're hiring a CFO there is a 600 person organization. So it's a pretty big, sizable organization with, I think overseeing some of the coolest functions of the city if you are into libraries. So, I think each individual job, like there's so much to be passionate about, and we basically have a function that does almost every kind of job you can imagine. So today we're hiring locksmiths, and we're also hiring street engineers, and we're hiring A&F professionals. So I personally think lots to be excited about there.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And Alex, just in conversation here, we can hear the passion in the work and in the opportunity in the city. So you have to tell us when you do get the opportunity to not be working. Tell us a little bit about how you enjoy yourself, or maybe how how you decompress with a lot of these moving parts.
Absolutely. So I have two small children. I have I don't know if hanging out with them necessarily counts as decompressing. I've got a 3-year-old and a 5.5-year-old, but they are incredible and so much fun, and certainly keep me busy and on my toes. So, in the general practice of free time, I wouldn't say I am swimming in it per se, but obviously love spending time with my family. My husband's also a public servant. He works at the MBTA, so we're really really strong in the local government in my household, and so made sure our kids are obsessed with trains and buses, which they are both obsessed with. And we love hanging around the city, and cooking is a passion of mine. Love food in all ways. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have if I had spare time, I also really love board games, but it's been a while since I've been able to do that personally.
We hear you loud and clear, Alex. Paul and I both have kids in that age range, so everything you just outlined is perfectly enough for when you're not on, right?
I'm getting pretty good at Candyland right now.
Exactly. My daughter is obsessed with the Fairy game, so plug for that board game if anyone likes it. What's amazing about that one is it's a cooperative game, so you're beating the board, which I think helps with my 5-year-old's inner competitiveness. It's not being taken out against anyone.
Yeah, I like that. Well, Alex, that's great, and it's good that you have that outlet with such a an important and kind of a busy job, leading the people function for the city. As we kind of think about moving into the future, maybe just a spot to start, what do you think most about relative to the workforce or the workplace as you kind of, look into the future, 12, 24, 36 months?
Yeah. So much to think about here. I really think it is just figuring out how we become a more human-centered organization. And, I know that word has a lot of meanings, and I don't really love the term about bringing your whole self to work, because I think a workplace is a workplace fundamentally, but being able to bring your authentic self to work might be a better way of saying it. So really just becoming a place where people can sustain and grow their careers, which I think we do really, really well in some places, and in other places we have a lot of room to grow. So one of the most exciting things that we've done relatively recently was launch employee transit benefits. So giving people really heavily subsidized access to public transportation, as well as making biking. So we've made Blue Bikes free for all of our employees. So just helping basically ease sort of financial burdens, but also encouraging mode transportation changes. And I think in the coming months, we're going to be thinking a lot more about that, thinking about how to help employees with housing challenges. We're also in the process of basically renegotiating. So when Mayor Wu took office, as I mentioned, we have 47 collective bargaining units. Every single one of those contracts had expired. So we've done a yeoman's effort getting almost all of our employees under contract. We still have a ways to go there, but we are already in our next round of negotiations to closing additional contracts. So basically that also just, figuring out how we meet employees where they are, listening through our collective bargaining process to what employees want. That is a tremendous amount of work that our labor team and our managers are focused on each and every day. So a ton of work there. And then I think, it might be surprising for people if you think about, government bureaucratic organizations. You would think that, we're going to have all of these processes that are super complicated and convoluted, and that is in some ways true. But a lot of our policies are not, in fact, written down as clearly as you might think that they are. And so a lot of them exist in, handbooks that haven't been updated in a really long time. So I think a really core focus of our upcoming 12 months is figuring out not only how do we make our policies more accessible and visible to folks, but we write them in more human-centered language so that people can understand it. I think HR policy tends to sound like it's written by lawyers, because it is, and lawyers are great and we need them, but also there are ways to make those policies understandable to humans while still being stamped of approval from the lawyers.
Yeah, what's the term now, Alex? TL semicolon DR?
Exactly. Too long didn't read. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So every policy should have a TLDR, give me 3 bullet points. And, lawyers are not a huge fan of that because there's lots of, and again, I sound like I'm hating on lawyers. I'm not. There's incredibly important work that lawyers do, but like often we can summarize things in a way that is helpful. So I think another one of the things I'm super proud of is we made some updates to our paid parental leave policy, which was awesome and became a little bit more generous and closed some loopholes. But even more proud of than the changes to the policy that we made, when we rewrote the policy, we accompanied it with a beautiful, well-illustrated guide that explained to people how they could use their leave benefits. And the city had never, at least to my knowledge, really done that, where we accompanied a policy change with something that people could really use and understand. And you could say, okay, well, if I take these weeks, this is how it impacts, things that just like when you read a 20-page document don't come through, but you look at a graphic that was made by a designer and you're like, oh, that makes sense. I understand how to use this thing. So I think that talks a lot to our approach. And that was an example where we did that really well and hope to continue to do that.
That's a great example, Alex, and it brings me to another question, and I think it's relative to this kind of future conversation. But looking back on kind of your growth through the city of Boston, as an employee, is there anything when you look back to your previous 10-year career with the city that now, as the leader of the people in HR function, you're able to say, because I had that experience as in probably the wrong term here, but as a rank and file employee, I now know that this is impactful. Is there any kind of substance to your role back then that is important now?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time people think so much about what it means to go up, right? And up in your next step. And obviously, I just want to underline saying there's an immense amount of privilege in what I'm saying here, right? Like you need to, getting increased salary is important because you need to support your family, and tons of implicit bias with how promotions work. Just want to caveat those pieces. But I think in general, often people think about the idea of like, how do I get to this next step and how do I move up? And I think I have generally viewed like, what is my next challenge? What is the next thing I want to learn about? What is the next thing I want to fix? Where is the area I want to grow? And that has included taking, parallel moves in an organization. Like, I think it's really hard to change both function and like domain at the same time. So how do if I want to increase my understanding of HR, that might mean taking a little bit of a lateral move or thinking about taking some doing my own skill building in that capacity. So I think just generally really like, I think this was the approach I took, and to some degree has been pretty successful, is not focusing on sort of like, how do I get to that next step, which I think is what a lot of people tend to really focus on, but more like, how do I build my skills and solve real problems for the organization and let that in turn sort of drive my next steps.
Yeah, no, that's great advice, Alex. And it, I kind of wanted to finish our conversation here. And again, not that this is a shameless plug, but I'd be curious, the following of the Why People podcast and the Boston HR Council is, 1,500 or so HR executives, pretty much a wider audience, with the podcast. As perhaps some of our council members or some of our viewers are thinking about or considering a municipal people in HR executive role, maybe some for the first time, curious about what your guidance or advice would be for someone thinking about taking that leap.
Do it. No. I mean, obviously that is what I think. I mean, I generally think you can hear my passion, and obviously I'm like, my bent is very clear here, but like when I look outside my window, like I literally can count to 10 before the things that happen outside in the real world come across my desk. Like, I mean that so genuinely. It happens all day, every day. And what could be more interesting than that? That said, right, like you have to have a level of grit and determination and honestly patience to realize that like it is a really complex context for good reason. And so that means, the whole like idea of moving fast and breaking things, it's not going to work here because we have to be here for the people. So I think it is both an incredibly exciting opportunity that I strongly encourage people to to consider, but also one that I encourage them to be thoughtful about, right? If you want to go to a place where there are going to be sort of like quick fixes and easy answers, then government's probably not for you. You're going to be like, but if you're willing to roll your sleeves up and get your hands dirty and deeply understand the context and realize that that both bold and incremental change can be possible at the same time, then really strongly encourage people to take a look at municipal government. I think we need to bring more people into the fold.
Yeah, that's great advice, Alex. And love the passion behind it. And we'll just finish on one final question. It would not be summer of 2023 if I didn't at least ask AI, ChatGPT, fill in the blank of this kind of next technology. How are you thinking about it?
Yeah, so I'm actually so glad you asked. Our absolutely brilliant CIO, Santi Garces, who is now the leader of our technology department, actually wrote an incredible and co-wrote with a bunch of researchers and a bunch of help some guidelines for how to use generative AI in the context of our workplace, which I think has been super and helpful in both sort of eliminating some fear around it, like, you know, where our job's going, et cetera, but also just creating some really good, thoughtful guidelines about how to use bias, about how to eliminate bias, how to, like, what are good use cases for generative AI, and how to cite when you've used generative AI in your work. So, you know, we think that generative AI does a pretty good first pass at writing a job description. A pretty good first pass at writing a scope of work, and we shouldn't shy away from those things. We're busy people, and they can provide help. Should they provide your last pass? Should they provide your final pass on those things? Absolutely not. It needs significant human review and a lot of thoughtfulness when you're using these tools. So I feel really proud that we've shared that with the entire workforce, some of the guidelines around how to use it. I think there is promise there. You know, do I have some family members who have some world-ending theories about what generative AI is going to do to the world? Yes. Does it sometimes keep me up at night? Sure. But I think, you know, in where we are today, there are some good uses that we can think about responsibly.
Awesome. I love that, Alex. Some passion behind the technology, but also some guidance and fair warning. Perfect spot. Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining us on the Why People podcast. We're excited about your role at the City of Boston and excited to watch kind of what the future holds for you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Talk to you soon.